Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into one of those topics that's equal parts strange, funny, and just a little sad. So, dim the lights, get comfortable under your blanket, and let's wander into a world where people had no Netflix, no caffeine-free sodas, and definitely no wellness podcasts telling them not to drink before bed. Instead, they had whatever they could smoke, chew, sniff, or sip to feel just a little less like themselves. Yes, tonight's journey is all about how people in the medieval world got high. And spoiler alert, it was both extremely creative and extremely bad for their health. But hey, when you're living in a drafty castle with no heating, the Black Death occasionally knocking on your door, and the nearest entertainment being some guy juggling geese in the village square, maybe you'd want a little escape too. Now, when we think about getting high, most of us picture modern substances. But in the Middle Ages, people didn't exactly have access to vape pens or a neat little joint rolled up from the shop down the street. Instead, they relied on plants, herbs, alcohol, and occasionally, whatever suspicious concoction their local healer swore would cure sadness, headaches, or probably both. Because of course, if you mix random roots together long enough, surely something good happens. Right, let's start gently with the most socially acceptable medieval drug of choice: alcohol, wine, beer, mead. Basically, if it fermented, they drank it, and they drank it a lot. Not because they were just looking to party, but because clean water was, well, not really a thing. You could drink from a stream, sure, but the odds of ending up with some sort of parasite swimming through your intestines were pretty high. So alcohol, weak as it might have been compared to modern standards, was the safer bet. And yes, that meant children were sipping ale with breakfast, because nothing says good morning like a frothy pint before school. But alcohol only gets you so far. If you were really looking for an out-of-body experience in the medieval world, you turned to plants. Let's float over to one of the most infamous, mandrake root. The mandrake was basically the celebrity hallucinogen of the era. Not only was it thought to scream when pulled from the ground, yes, actually scream, as in cover your ears or you'll drop dead, but people believed it had powerful magical properties. Witches were especially associated with it, which is medieval shorthand for this will definitely mess you up. People made potions with mandrake, rubbed it into their skin, or even used it as a kind of medieval anesthesia. Though anesthesia in the 1300s usually just meant you'll still feel everything, but maybe you'll be too dazed to notice. And mandrake wasn't alone. Other plants with hallucinogenic or narcotic effects included henbane, belladonna, and hemlock. Fun fact, belladonna literally means beautiful woman, because in Renaissance times, women used it to dilate their pupils, thinking it made them look more attractive. Which is sort of true, but also, it can kill you. So, beauty tips were a little darker back then. Meanwhile, peasants were more likely to stumble upon their highs by accident. Take ergot, for example. This was a fungus that grew on rye and other grains, and if you happened to eat bread made from contaminated flour, congratulations, you were about to have one of the worst psychedelic trips of your life. Ergot poisoning could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even gangrene. Entire villages sometimes ended up twitching and screaming, because the local baker didn't notice his flour was glowing green. Some historians even suggest that outbreaks of ergot poisoning contributed to witchcraft panics, because people literally thought they were seeing demons. Which, to be fair, they kind of were, just the hallucinogenic kind. And then there were the elites. Nobles, of course, had access to stronger, stranger substances. Opium had been known since antiquity, and through trade routes stretching from the Middle East, it occasionally made its way into Europe. Was it common? Not exactly. Was it treasured? Absolutely. And if a medieval king looked a little too calm during his gout attack, maybe don't ask too many questions. But drugs weren't just for fun. Many of these substances were wrapped up in medicine, religion, and superstition. A monk prescribing you mandrake wine might not have been trying to help you escape reality. He was probably just convinced it would balance your humors. Because in medieval medicine, you weren't sick because of bacteria or viruses. No, You were sick because your hot, wet, dry, and cold humors were out of balance, which meant if you were depressed, you might need to sniff a little henbane smoke to reset yourself. Logical? Not at all. But that didn't stop anyone from trying. Now, if you're imagining peasants stumbling through the fields, nobles drooling on their velvet cushions, and monks buzzing off herbs, you're not entirely wrong. But the truth is, medieval highs weren't usually glamorous. They were messy, risky, and often deadly. Still, they tell us something important. Humans have always looked for ways to change their reality. Even in the darkest centuries, even in drafty castles, people wanted a little escape. And with that, let's drift into our next exploration. Because if plants and fungi weren't enough, people also got high on religion. So, religion, which, in medieval Europe, was basically the Netflix, Instagram, and Spotify of its time. It was entertainment, comfort, and a full-blown lifestyle brand, all rolled into one. And, not surprisingly, people often managed to get a little high on it. Sometimes literally. Let's start with the monks. Monks loved their herbs, not in a weed dispensary kind of way, but in a God gave us these plants, so let's use them for everything sort of vibe. They brewed herbal concoctions, not only for medicine, but also for spiritual enhancement. A strong infusion of sage or valerian could calm the nerves during long prayer sessions, and if your mind wandered into strange, dreamy territory while chanting psalms in a cold stone chapel, well, maybe that was divine inspiration. Or maybe it was just valerian root kicking in. And then, there were the mystics. Medieval Europe was full of holy men and women who claimed to have visions of God, angels, or, if they were unlucky, demons. Modern scholars sometimes suggest these visions might not have been purely spiritual. Malnutrition, fasting, lack of sleep, and yes, the occasional herbal stimulant could all combine into a nice little hallucinatory package. Take Hildegard of Bingen, for example, a famous abbess, composer, and mystic of the 12th century. She described elaborate visions full of lights, colors, and cosmic imagery. Were they religious revelations? Maybe. Or maybe a mix of migraines, fasting, and medieval medicine that left her brain buzzing like a faulty lantern. Either way, her followers were convinced she was tuned in to the divine Wi-Fi. Of course, the church didn't officially endorse tripping on mandrake or belladonna, but ironically, some of the very substances later linked to witchcraft were used in small, controlled doses by healers and even clerics. The difference between a holy tonic and witch's brew usually just came down to who was drinking it. If a monk gave you a cup, it was medicine. If a barefoot old woman in the forest gave you the same thing, suddenly it was heresy. Because consistency was never the medieval church's strong point. But it wasn't just herbs and visions. Religion itself could act as a kind of collective high. Imagine being in a candlelit cathedral, surrounded by incense smoke, so thick you could barely see. The organ rumbles. The choir chants in Latin, a language most people couldn't understand anyway. The sound vibrates in your chest. The air smells sweet and strange. And suddenly, you feel it. A trance-like state. You might call it the Holy Spirit. A neuroscientist today might call it sensory overload mixed with hypoxia. But either way, people left those cathedrals feeling transported. And honestly, who needs psychedelics when you've got Gregorian chants echoing for 45 minutes straight? Still, let's not pretend the medieval church was all incense highs and angelic visions. Some people got their altered states through sheer physical suffering. Fasting until you were half-conscious, whipping yourself bloody in the streets during plague outbreaks, or kneeling on stone floors until your legs went numb. These were all ways to purify the soul, and, conveniently, they also sent the brain into some interesting chemical spirals. Because yes, starving yourself and losing half your blood supply will make you see things, probably not things you'd want to see, but still. Meanwhile, outside the cloisters and cathedrals, ordinary people found their own spiritual highs. Pilgrimages, for example, were basically the medieval version of a road trip mixed with a music festival. People walked hundreds of miles, exhausted themselves, prayed, sang, and often experienced euphoric moments along the way. Was it God? Was it dehydration? Maybe both, but either way, they came home telling stories of visions and miracles, and that, in turn, kept the whole religious high cycle going. Now, before you think this was all very peaceful and holy, let's not forget the darker side. Those same plants that gave monks a gentle buzz were also tied to the infamous witches' flying ointments. Allegedly, women accused of witchcraft would mix herbs like belladonna, mandrake, and henbane into a greasy salve, rub it on their skin, and off they went on broomsticks. Or at least, that's what inquisitors claimed. In reality, what likely happened is that the ointment absorbed through the skin, causing vivid hallucinations of flying, which honestly sounds more fun than kneeling in church for 6 hours, but apparently it was grounds for burning at the stake. So, between the holy trances, the incense clouds, the flying ointments, and the herbal medicine, religion in the medieval world was far more psychedelic than we usually imagine. Not everyone was floating on clouds of divine visions, of course, but enough were that the line between spiritual ecstasy and chemical trip got very thin. And with that, let us shuffle quietly to another corner of medieval life where people got high without even meaning to. The kitchens and pantries. Because when your food storage system is basically hope it doesn't mold, you'd be surprised what ends up on your plate. So, kitchens. In the medieval world, these weren't cozy rooms with copper pans and a nice sourdough starter bubbling in the corner. No, they were smoky, drafty, chaotic spaces where food storage was always a gamble and expiration date was basically a rumor. And that meant sometimes, just sometimes, your dinner turned into an unintentional psychedelic experiment. We already talked about ergot, that sneaky fungus that liked to invade rye. But ergot wasn't the only trouble lurking in medieval bread. Grains were often stored in damp conditions, which meant mold, bugs, and fungi were a normal part of the package. And when you ground that into flour, baked it, and fed it to your family, let's just say hallucinations for everyone wasn't entirely off the menu. Villages sometimes had mass outbreaks of what looked like madness. People convulsed, twitched, saw visions, and screamed about demons. Modern historians look back and say, yeah, that was ergot poisoning again. But at the time, oh no, it had to be witchcraft, or divine punishment, or maybe both. Because of course, if everyone in town is writhing on the floor, the most logical explanation is that Satan personally paid a visit, and food-related highs didn't stop at bread. Medieval cooks loved to spice things up with whatever herbs they could get their hands on. Sometimes that meant tasty, harmless additions like parsley or thyme. Other times it meant throwing in a little henbane or datura because someone swore it cured indigestion. Spoiler, it didn't. What it did do was make you feel like your soul was leaving your body, which, to be fair, is one way to forget your stomachache. Then there was nutmeg. Oh, nutmeg. Today we sprinkle it on lattes and eggnog like it's harmless. But in large doses, nutmeg is a powerful hallucinogen. And medieval people, bless them, didn't always understand the concept of serving size. They knew nutmeg came from faraway lands and was incredibly expensive. So naturally, the rich showed off by overusing it. Picture a nobleman dumping half a jar of nutmeg into his wine just to flex on the guests. What he got instead was a night of dizziness, nausea, and maybe seeing Jesus at the dinner table. Speaking of wine, medieval wine was not the smooth, carefully aged stuff we imagine today. It was often sour, gritty, and improved with whatever additives were lying around. Lead, for example, was sometimes added to sweeten wine. Yes, lead. And nothing says pleasant evening buzz quite like slowly poisoning yourself. Chronic lead poisoning probably explained why so many nobles had bizarre health issues. Pale skin, trembling hands, random mood swings. Sure, let's blame genetics, but maybe, just maybe, it was a leaded wine. And then there were the experiments. Medieval people loved making weird liquors, tonics, and infused drinks. Some were fairly harmless, like honey mead with herbs. Others were questionable, Imagine a drink steeped with opium poppies, henbane seeds, and a touch of mandrake root. Was it medicine? Was it witchcraft? Was it Tuesday night? No one really knew. All they knew was that after a cup or two, the walls started to breathe, and the prayers sounded a little too loud. Of course, not everyone had access to this level of culinary chaos. Peasants mostly ate bread, porridge, and maybe some onions if they were lucky. Their highs came more often from spoiled food, moldy rye, or fermented odds and ends. But even then, there was a kind of democratization of altered states. Whether you were a noble chugging leaded wine or a farmer twitching from bad bread, reality had a way of shifting under your feet. And the funniest part, none of this was recreational in the way we think of today. Nobody sat around saying, "Let's get high for fun." It was always framed as medicine, as religion, as necessity, or just as an accident. But the effect, that dreamy, dizzy, not quite here feeling, was the same. And for people living in a world of plague, war, and drafty stone walls, maybe slipping out of reality for a few hours wasn't the worst thing. Now, speaking of slipping out of reality, let's wander into another odd corner of the medieval mind. Because while food and drink could make you woozy, there was another method people swore by. Inhaling smoke. Yes, before the modern cigarette, there were all kinds of creative ways to set things on fire and breathe it in. And, unsurprisingly, medieval people were very, very bad at it. So, smoke. Because of course, if you can burn it, someone, at some point, tried to inhale it. Medieval people weren't exactly masters of chemistry, but they had fire, curiosity, and way too much free time in winter. And that's usually all it takes. Now, let's clear one thing up right away. Medieval Europe did not have tobacco. That only came to Europe after Columbus brought it back from the Americas in the late 15th century. So no medieval knight was leaning against a castle wall, puffing a Marlboro. Instead, Europeans experimented with what they did have. Herbs. Lots of them. Sage, thyme, rosemary, lavender. These were the usual suspects, not necessarily because they got you high, in a modern sense, but because they were believed to cleanse the body, ward off disease, or chase away evil spirits. A healer might throw a handful of herbs on the fire and tell you to sit in the smoke. Congratulations, you're basically hotboxing with rosemary. Did it work? Not really. Did it smell nice? Absolutely. But then, of course, there were the stronger herbs. Henbane smoke was a popular one, used in rituals and medicine. In small doses, it could dull pain or create a light trance. In larger doses, it could send you spiraling into hallucinations about demons, flying, or accidentally confessing all your sins to the family goat. People also burned opium poppies, though access was rare and usually limited to the very rich or very well-connected. Still, the idea was there. Set fire to it, breathe it in, and wait for your problems to dissolve into the rafters. And let's not forget incense. On the surface, incense was all about worship. Churches filled their halls with the heavy scent of frankincense and myrrh, creating a holy atmosphere. But incense smoke is also mildly psychoactive. Not enough to make you see angels tap dancing, but enough to alter your mood, relax you, and maybe convince you that the flickering candle really was a sign from God. Priests might not have called it getting high, but the effect wasn't too far off. Interestingly, some records suggest people also inhaled fumes from heated chemicals. For example, mercury vapors. Doctors, and I use that word generously here, sometimes recommended patients sit over bowls of heated mercury or sulfur to cleanse the body, which, in reality, just poisoned them faster. If you've ever wondered why medieval alchemists often went mad, well, inhaling mercury fumes in a small stone room will do that. But smoke wasn't always deliberate. Medieval homes were full of it, all the time. Fireplaces smoked up entire rooms. Kitchens were choking clouds of soot, and blackened rafters dripped tarry residue. Children, adults, nobles, peasants, everyone inhaled wood smoke constantly. And while that didn't exactly get you high, it did create a kind of dazed, oxygen-deprived stupor. Imagine sitting in a smoky hall for hours, your eyes burning, your head buzzing. Add a cup of ale, and yes, you might feel floaty. Not because you were enlightened, but because you were slowly suffocating. And then, of course, there were the magical smoke experiments. Witches, or at least people accused of being witches, were said to burn hallucinogenic herbs in cauldrons. Villagers swore the fumes gave them visions, curses, or the ability to see the devil himself. In reality, most of those fumes just knocked people out. But in a world where every odd sensation was either God or Satan, that was more than enough to panic an entire village. If nothing else, medieval smoke culture reminds us of something simple. Humans are endlessly curious about what happens if we burn stuff and inhale it. Sometimes it's sage. Sometimes it's opium. Sometimes it's just moldy straw that accidentally caught fire. Either way, the result is the same. People coughing, eyes watering, but secretly wondering if maybe, just maybe, they felt a little different. So, by now we've covered drinking, eating, and smoking your way into medieval altered states. But there's still one more angle we haven't touched. The world of medicine. Because if you think today's pharmaceuticals have side effects, just wait until you hear about what medieval doctors prescribed to cure headaches, fevers, or everyone's favorite bad humors. So, medicine. If you've ever looked at a medieval prescription, you know it was basically pick 5 random plants, stir them into wine, and pray really hard. The science was non-existent, but the side effects, oh, those were very real, and quite a few of them involved getting high. The cornerstone of medieval medicine was the theory of humors. You weren't sick because of germs. No. You were sick because your blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were out of balance. Logical, not in the slightest. But it gave doctors an excuse to throw absolutely anything into your body in hopes of resetting the balance. Enter the potion cabinet. Mandrake, henbane, belladonna, poppies, datura, all made appearances in medieval medicine. These were powerful plants, packed with alkaloids. Small doses dulled pain. Medium doses caused hallucinations. Large doses, well, large doses meant the doctor wouldn't be sending you a bill, because you'd be dead. But in that hazy middle ground, patients often drifted into trances, dreamlike states, or total disconnection from reality. Imagine going in for a toothache and coming out convinced you seeing the Virgin Mary dancing on your ceiling beams. And then there was surgery. Let's be clear. Medieval surgery was not something you wanted. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, no sterile instruments. Just a man with a rusty saw and way too much confidence. But sometimes, doctors did try to make it easier. They brewed soporific sponges, soaked in opium, mandrake, and henbane, then held them under a patient's nose. The result was mixed. Some patients drifted into a half-conscious stupor. Others coughed, gagged, and begged the surgeon to just get it over with. But it was better than nothing. And at least a few lucky souls got to experience their amputations through a soft, dreamy haze. Medicine also leaned heavily on alcohol. Doctors prescribed wine for just about everything. Fever, wine. Depression, wine. Childbirth, definitely wine. In fact, one common childbirth aid was a strong herbal drink laced with poppy juice. The goal was to dull the pain. The side effect was that both mother and baby often entered the world already buzzing. Not the safest system, but hey, it was the Middle Ages. Expectations were low. And of course, we can't forget the alchemists. These were the proto-scientists of the day, mixing strange concoctions in dark laboratories, convinced they could turn lead into gold. Along the way, they inhaled, drank, and rubbed on all sorts of substances that absolutely altered their states of mind. Mercury, arsenic, sulfur fumes, you name it, they sniffed it. Some even claimed mystical visions as a result. Modern historians look at their notes and say, "Yep, that's just mercury poisoning." But in the moment, the alchemist himself probably thought he was touching the mind of God. One particularly dangerous but popular treatment was laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol. It wasn't called laudanum yet, but versions of it existed centuries before the word was coined. Doctors loved it. Patients loved it. And if anyone became a little too dependent on it, well, medieval society didn't exactly have a rehab clinic, so people just kept sipping, floating in and out of blissful numbness. And then there were the stranger recipes, things like powdered toad, mixed with wine, or dried viper, boiled into broth. Did these get you high? Maybe not in the psychedelic sense, but they definitely had a psychological effect. Because if you're sitting there drinking snake soup because your doctor said it, LL cure your gout, you're probably already halfway to an altered state of mind. The important thing to remember is this. In medieval times, medicine and intoxication overlapped constantly. The line between treatment and trip was almost non-existent. A doctor might swear a poppy mixture was strictly medicinal, but the dreamy smile on his patient's face suggested otherwise. And since nobody really understood dosages, the results were unpredictable. One sip too many, and suddenly the feverish knight was convinced he could talk to saints. But medicine wasn't just about plants and potions. Sometimes the treatment itself, the ritual, the chanting, the prayers, added another layer of altered state. A doctor might bleed you until you were faint, then wave incense in your face, then recite charms. By the end of it, you'd be dizzy, lightheaded, and maybe convinced you'd been healed. Placebo effect, absolutely. But with enough smoke, blood loss, and poppy juice, the placebo started to feel like the real deal. So yes, in a way, medieval doctors were the accidental drug dealers of their day. They didn't mean to get people high. But when you're throwing mandrake, henbane, and opium into every other recipe, it's going to happen. And honestly, for people living in a world without painkillers, antibiotics, or even Advil, those little trips might have been the only relief they ever knew. And with that, let's drift gently toward another realm of medieval highs. We've covered food, drink, smoke, and medicine. But there's one last place people found altered states without even trying. Their own body. Because between fasting, fevers, and exhaustion, the medieval body was basically a built-in drug machine. So, the human body, honestly, it doesn't take much for it to start acting like its own little drug lab. Starve it, overwork it, heat it up, or deprive it of sleep, and suddenly you're seeing colors that aren't there. And in the medieval world, where all those things were basically daily life, altered states were almost routine. Let's start with fasting. Religious fasting was everywhere in the Middle Ages. Monks, nuns, priests, and ordinary people all practiced it at different times of the year. Lent, Advent, holy days, saint days. Basically, if the church calendar said so, you skipped your meals and prayed harder. The result, malnutrition, dizziness, and sometimes hallucinations. Many saints claim to have visions during fasting periods, and maybe they did. But it's also possible they were just really hungry. Try going 3 days without bread and see if your brain dosing tea starts sending you divine push notifications. Then there's sleep deprivation. Monks were especially guilty of this. Many monasteries followed strict schedules that required waking up several times a night to pray. Imagine being dragged out of bed at 2 a.m. to chant psalms in a freezing chapel, then going back to sleep, then being woken up again at 5. After a while, the line between dream and waking blurred. Visions, voices, strange lights, all of it showed up when you barely slept and you rerunning on stale bread and watery ale. Of course they thought it was holy. In reality, they were basically pulling medieval all-nighters until their brains gave up. Another culprit, fevers. In a world without antibiotics, infections often raged unchecked. A simple cut could turn into a raging fever that lasted days. And when your body's temperature spikes, the brain tends to get creative. Medieval patients described demons in their rooms, angels at their bedside, and all sorts of surreal hallucinations. Doctors, naturally, took these as signs of spiritual struggle. Modern medicine just calls it delirium. But to the person sweating it out in a straw bed, the experience was probably as real as anything. And let's not forget exhaustion. Peasants worked long, brutal hours in the fields, often with little to eat. Knights spent days in armor, marching or fighting in the sun. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles with blistered feet, By the time they collapsed into bed or into the dirt, their bodies were buzzing with fatigue. And fatigue has a funny way of mimicking intoxication. Slurred words, clumsy movements, even little bursts of euphoria. Was it a spiritual high, or just a medieval equivalent of pulling a double shift without coffee? Probably both. Now, combine all of these: fasting, sleeplessness, fever, exhaustion, and you get some of the strangest stories in medieval chronicles. People claimed to levitate during prayer, to glow with holy light, to hear voices of saints guiding them. And while some of these might have been genuine spiritual experiences, plenty were almost certainly the body's natural chemicals misfiring under stress. In other words, medieval highs powered by nothing but suffering. But here's the thing. People wanted these states. Saints and mystics weren't ashamed of them. They chased them. They believed suffering purified the soul, and visions proved their holiness. A monk, half-starved, feverish, and trembling, wasn't just sick. He was special. And the church often celebrated these altered states, writing them down as miracles. Which, honestly, is one way to turn dangerous malnutrition into good PR. And of course, not every natural high came from religion. Think about childbirth. Without modern pain relief, women often slipped into trances, delirium, or even out-of-body experiences during labor. Some later described seeing visions of saints or angels. Others just remembered the haze. In either case, pain itself became a drug, one that carried them somewhere else for hours on end. Another common source: near-death experiences. With disease, famine, and war everywhere, people frequently brushed up against death. Survivors often described floating sensations, bright lights, or peaceful visions. Today we know oxygen deprivation can cause this. But in the Middle Ages, it was proof of the afterlife. And once again, the line between brain chemistry and divine encounter blurred until it basically disappeared. So yes, medieval life had plenty of highs built right in. You didn't need mandrake or henbane if you were already starving, sick, or working yourself into the ground. The body itself supplied the trip. And in a society obsessed with suffering as a path to holiness, these natural highs weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Which brings us to another curious layer of this whole story. Because while peasants and monks were busy starving or hallucinating on moldy bread, the wealthy had their own unique cocktail of altered states. And unlike the poor, they often chased them not through deprivation, but through sheer indulgence. Imagine a grand hall, lit by dozens of flickering torches. The air is heavy with roasted meats, spiced wine, and the sweet smoke of incense. A bard is strumming a lute in the corner, and at the center of it all, a long wooden table, groaning under the weight of food and drink. This was the nobleman's playground, and their version of a medieval high. Let's start with the obvious. Alcohol, wine, mead, and ale flowed endlessly in the castles of Europe. For peasants, ale was weak and watery, just enough to keep them hydrated. But nobles had access to the strong stuff. Imported wines from Italy, spiced with cinnamon or cloves, honeyed mead, and rich, potent brews. Banquets often stretched deep into the night, and by the end, most lords and ladies were swaying in their seats, red-faced, and stumbling through slurred conversations. Drunkenness wasn't just tolerated, it was practically expected. A tipsy noble was a merry noble, but it wasn't only drink. Food itself could create a kind of intoxication. Picture a night after a long feast, stuffed with roast swan, venison, pies, cheeses, and sugared fruits. Medieval doctors actually warned about food drunkenness, where overeating left people dizzy, flushed, and giddy. Gluttony was a sin, sure, but that didn't stop nobles from indulging. And in those moments, the sheer sensory overload of taste, smell, and fullness was its own kind of high. Then there was luxury and sensory pleasure. Perfumes imported from the East, fabrics dyed in rare colors, jewels glittering in candlelight. These weren't just status symbols. They were intoxicating to people who had never seen such wealth before. Imagine running your hands over silk for the first time in a world where most people wore rough wool, or breathing in the heavy scent of frankincense. while the rest of the countryside smelled like mud and manure. For nobles, these experiences weren't just luxuries, they were mind-altering in their own way. And let's not forget music and dance. In great halls, minstrels and troubadours spun songs that made nobles laugh, weep, or swoon. Dancing, after a few cups of wine, could easily turn into a dizzy, euphoric whirl. For a society with no nightclubs or festivals the way we know them, these moments of collective rhythm and sound felt transcendent, almost like stepping out of ordinary time. But here's where it gets more curious. Nobles also chased stranger highs that bordered on dangerous. For example, some courts experimented with exotic substances, brought along trade routes, rare herbs, strong spices, even early distillations that hinted at stronger alcohol to come. These were prized not just for their taste, but for the unusual sensations they caused. And of course, there was love and lust, courtly romance, secret affairs, and the thrill of forbidden encounters carried their own addictive rush. For monks, ecstasy came through prayer. For nobles, it often came through whispered words in candlelit chambers. The highs of passion, jealousy, and desire were just as intoxicating as any herb or drink. But indulgence had its costs. Too much wine left men bloated and sickly. Too much rich food caused gout, nicknamed the disease of kings. Too much pleasure made people reckless, spending fortunes and ruining reputations. And yet, they couldn't resist, because in a dark, uncertain world filled with plague and war, a night of excess felt like snatching joy out of the jaws of mortality. So while peasants hallucinated from hunger, nobles stumbled through nights of feasting, music, and luxury. Two very different paths, leading to the same destination. The human desire to escape, even just for a little while, from the ordinary weight of medieval life. Now, let's tiptoe into the murkier side of things, because not every high in the medieval world was pleasant. Some were accidents, some were experiments gone wrong, and some were just plain deadly. One of the strangest culprits was ergot, a fungus that grew on rye and other grains. When eaten accidentally in bread, it produced a terrifying condition later called St. Anthony's fire. Victims suffered burning sensations in their limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, gangrene that turned fingers and toes black before they fell off. And yet, in its earliest stages, ergot also caused wild visions, euphoria, and a feeling of being detached from reality. Imagine entire villages stumbling around, convinced they were seeing angels or devils, when in truth they'd just eaten bad bread. A mass hallucination brought on by dinner rolls. But ergot wasn't the only unintentional trip. People sometimes inhaled fumes from metals and chemicals in workshops or apothecaries. Lead, mercury, arsenic. These were used in everything from makeup to medicine. And while alchemists swore these substances had mystical powers, the truth is that many were slowly poisoning themselves. Symptoms included tremors, mood swings, and hallucinations. In other words, they thought they were reaching enlightenment, but really, they were just dying faster. Then, there were the intentional poisons, because if you're a medieval noble, odds are you've at least considered poisoning someone. Some poisons were fast, like hemlock. Others worked slowly, like arsenic. And here's the twist. In small doses, some poisons actually acted like stimulants or relaxants. Take belladonna, also called deadly nightshade. A tiny amount dilated pupils, made skin warm, and gave the sensation of floating. In larger amounts, it killed you. But that didn't stop people from experimenting. Medieval women even dripped belladonna juice into their eyes to make them appear wide and glassy. A look considered beautiful, though it also blurred their vision and occasionally caused permanent blindness. Fashion, but make it toxic. Another curious one was mandrake root. Folklore said it screamed when pulled from the ground, loud enough to kill anyone who heard it. In reality, it didn't scream, but it was full of alkaloids that caused drowsiness, hallucinations, and strange dreams. Physicians used it as an anesthetic, slipping pieces of it into wine before surgery. Patients would drift off into a trance-like state, sometimes muttering about visions of demons or angels, sometimes just snoring loudly. It was a medieval cocktail of fear, pain relief, and accidental tripping. Of course, not everyone was dabbling with poison on purpose. Sometimes the line between medicine and intoxication blurred completely. A doctor might prescribe opium for pain, henbane for sleep, or mercury for syphilis. Patients trusted these treatments and often ended up addicted, hallucinating, or worse. But in a world with few other options, even a dangerous high felt preferable to relentless suffering. And then, there's the question of madness. Some medieval rulers were described as being possessed or cursed, but when you look closer, many probably suffered from untreated illnesses or from years of exposure to toxic substances. King Charles VI of France, for example, believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. Was that madness, or was it the result of endless feasting on contaminated food, inhaling incense, and swallowing questionable medicines? Hard to say, but his glass delusion was certainly its own kind of high. A fragile, dangerous one. So, while some medieval highs came from bread, wine, or herbs, others came from poisons, illnesses, and treatments that blurred into slow intoxication. It was a world where escaping pain often meant flirting with death, and yet people kept reaching for those substances over and over, because even a dangerous high was better than no relief at all. Religion, in the medieval world, wasn't just a Sunday activity. It was the backdrop of life. Every bell, every ritual, every candle was part of a world saturated with faith. And with that came something that, to us, looks a lot like another kind of high. Take the saints' visions. Again and again, we hear stories of holy men and women experiencing divine ecstasy. They saw angels, spoke with Christ, even claimed to feel their souls lifted straight out of their bodies. Now, were these moments genuine spiritual experiences? Possibly. But we also have to remember, many of these visions happened after days of fasting, sleeplessness, and constant prayer. In other words, they were starving, exhausted, oxygen deprived, and maybe have combined that with a heavy atmosphere of incense, and suddenly a glowing light in the corner might look suspiciously divine. One famous case is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who reported vivid visions of fiery wheels and cosmic symphonies. Her followers believed she was touched by God. Modern scholars suggest she may have suffered from migraines with aura, the kind that cause shimmering lights, zigzag patterns, and strange sensations. To her, it was a heavenly choir. To a neurologist, it was brain chemistry gone sideways. Either way, the effect was the same. A deeply altered state that shaped her life and writings. And it wasn't just nuns and monks. Pilgrims on long journeys often described entering trances. After walking for weeks in rough conditions, eating little more than bread, and sleeping under the stars, many claimed to hear voices or feel an overwhelming sense of presence. Modern hiking enthusiasts call it trail high. Medieval Christians called it the hand of God. There's also the role of chanting and music. Gregorian chants, sung in echoing stone cathedrals, weren't just pretty. They were hypnotic, long, droning, repetitive melodies could lull listeners into a trance-like state, somewhere between prayer and sleep. Add flickering candlelight and clouds of incense, and it's not hard to imagine a congregation swaying slightly, caught between earth and heaven, their minds floating in the rhythm. And then, there's self-flagellation. Groups of penitents would march through towns, whipping themselves, bloodied backs glistening in torchlight, chanting prayers. Pain, exhaustion, and adrenaline combined into something strange, a rush that felt holy. Witnesses swore they looked entranced, their faces serene despite the agony. In a sense, it was a chemically free high, built from the body's own endorphins. But religion also created communal highs. Festivals, relic showings, and miracle plays drew crowds that we'd probably describe today as ecstatic. Imagine thousands of people pressing around a reliquary, convinced they were in the presence of a saint's fingerbone, the air thick with incense, the crowd swaying, voices raised. It was a collective euphoria, a spiritual rave, minus the glow sticks. And yet, the line between holy experience and something else was often thin. A monk's vision could be divine inspiration, or it could be food poisoning. A nun's trance could be God speaking through her, or just ergot in the convent's rye bread. Medieval people rarely separated the physical from the spiritual. So whether the cause was chemical or cosmic, the effect was the same: awe, fear, and the unshakable belief that they'd touched another realm. So while nobles drank themselves silly, and peasants chewed strange herbs in smoky huts, the religious orders found their own highs: hunger, pain, prayer, and song, all different roads to the same altered state. If monasteries were all about quiet highs from prayer and fasting, then festivals and carnivals were the complete opposite. Think of them as medieval block parties, only with more mud, more ale, and far fewer rules. One of the biggest was Carnival, held right before Lent. The logic was simple. Lent meant fasting and self-denial. So Carnival meant doing the exact opposite: eat too much, drink too much, sing, dance, and generally make a spectacle of yourself while you still could. Whole towns erupted into parades, costumes, and plays, mocking priests, nobles, and sometimes even kings. For a few days, peasants dressed like lords, fools sat on mock thrones, and rules just melted away. And with the drinking, oh, the drinking! Barrels of ale rolled into squares, jugs of wine passed hand to hand. By mid-afternoon, the crowd was swaying together like one massive hiccuping organism. Laughter rang out, songs turned bawdy, and inhibitions went straight out the window. People described the sensation as freeing, almost otherworldly, a communal intoxication that blurred class, status, and sin. For peasants who lived under strict hierarchies every other day of the year, this chaos was intoxicating in its own right. Then there was the Feast of Fools. This was a special kind of upside-down holiday, especially popular in cathedrals. Clergy dressed in costumes, sometimes as animals, sometimes as women, sometimes as each other. They sang nonsense hymns, paraded donkeys into churches, and basically turned sacred rituals into comedy skits. To modern eyes, it looks like irreverence. To medieval participants, it was a controlled burst of chaos, a ritualized way of letting off steam. And in the thick incense, candlelight, and drunken laughter, the line between parody and ecstasy blurred quickly. Even more famous was the Feast of Corpus Christi, with its massive processions and plays. Imagine standing in a crowd watching a wagon roll by, carrying actors dressed as angels, devils, and saints. Smoke from torches filled the air, choirs sang, bells rang. A sensory overload. Children gawked, adults cheered, and everyone left feeling dazed and awed. No substances needed. The sheer collective energy was intoxicating. And then there were the more earthy festivals, harvest feasts, midsummer celebrations, weddings that lasted a week. These were less about ritual and more about pure release. Bonfires blazed, people leaped over flames, drums pounded, fiddles squealed, couples slipped off into the fields, neighbors laughed until they cried, and ale mugs clinked endlessly. For many peasants, this was the only time the year felt light, the only escape from grinding work. Interestingly, many festivals encouraged behavior that looked suspiciously like trance, dancing in circles, singing the same lines over and over, clapping and stomping until everyone's heartbeat matched the rhythm. Some observers swore that dancers seemed possessed, and occasionally they were. Dancing plagues broke out in parts of Europe, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, unable to stop. Historians still debate why. Maybe it was ergot poisoning, maybe hysteria, maybe just mass exhaustion. But the result was the same: an entire town moving as one, caught in a strange, euphoric haze. And it wasn't just Europe. Across the medieval world, festivals carried their own intoxicating power. From Persia Nowruz celebrations to Indian Holi, with its clouds of colored powder, communities created highs through ritual, rhythm, and sheer abundance. People didn't need opium or belladonna. The combination of sound, movement, and collective joy was enough to lift them out of ordinary life. So, Whether through carnival's drunken chaos or Corpus Christi's sacred awe, medieval festivals gave people something rare, a taste of freedom. For a few days, reality loosened its grip. Everyone was laughing, singing, staggering a little, and floating together in a haze that wasn't just chemical, but communal. Dreams, to us, they're just the brain's late-night screensaver, a jumble of half-formed images. But in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't random. They were messages, prophecies, warnings, little cracks in the wall between earth and heaven. And drifting into them felt like slipping into another world entirely. Medieval people took their dreams seriously. Kings hired interpreters, monasteries kept records of visions, and entire battles were justified because someone swore they saw a saint or angel in their sleep. To them, the dream state was more than rest. It was a kind of trance, a nightly ritual of leaving the body behind and wandering through strange landscapes. And you didn't even need drugs for it. Just sleep in a drafty hut after a heavy meal of ale and bread, or collapse after a long day in the fields. Add in flickering firelight, the sound of animals shifting in the dark, and you were halfway to a dream before your eyes even shut. Medieval beds, with their heavy curtains and piles of furs, created little cocoons of warmth where the outside world blurred away. To the sleeper, it must have felt like floating. But dreams weren't just private. Sometimes they became public, almost performative. A monk might wake and announce a vision of the Virgin Mary, and suddenly the whole convent felt lifted, as though they too had shared the experience. Pilgrims at shrines often fell into dreamlike trances, swearing they saw miracles in the night. And once the story spread, everyone else started half believing it too. Collective dreaming, fueled by faith and expectation. And then there were incubation dreams. This was the practice of sleeping in holy places, shrines, chapels, even beside relics. In the hope of receiving a divine message, pilgrims would lie down on stone floors or wooden benches, often fasting beforehand, waiting for a saint to appear in their dreams. Some claimed healing visions, others swore they were given cures, advice, or warnings. The line between sleep, prayer, and intoxication blurred, until it was all one strange, half-conscious state. Night itself had its own high. Without electricity, the medieval world was pitch dark after sunset. The stars blazed brighter, the moon cast eerie shadows, and every creak and rustle seemed amplified. People spoke of the deep hours as times when spirits moved more freely, when witches flew, when the dead whispered. Staying awake at night often meant being half-dreaming, eyes heavy, thoughts meandering, a natural intoxication, courtesy of exhaustion and imagination. Interestingly, medieval sleep was usually segmented. People didn't sleep straight through 8 hours. They had a first sleep after dusk, woke up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then went back to their second sleep until dawn. That in-between period was liminal, part waking, part dreaming. People prayed, whispered, or even visited neighbors in that strange midnight interval. Some claimed visions were strongest then. In a sense, the entire sleep cycle acted like a ritualized trip, broken into phases of immersion, wakeful reflection, and descent again. And of course, dreams could be terrifying. Nightmares were often seen as demonic attacks, incubi or succubi, sitting on the sleeper's chest. The feeling of sleep paralysis, with its crushing weight and inability to move, fed countless legends of demons or witches. A medical condition, yes, but also one of the most intense highs the medieval mind could imagine. So, even without herbs or potions, the medieval night carried its own intoxication, a world of shadows, dreams, visions, and fears, where the line between real and unreal dissolved every evening, only to be rebuilt at dawn. Every so often, medieval Europe fell into something that can only be described as a collective trance. People called it many things: possession, hysteria, curses, but historians today usually lump it under dancing mania. And no, that's not a cute nickname. It was terrifying, exhausting, and weirdly euphoric all at once. The most famous outbreak hit Strasbourg in 1518, according to reports. A woman named Frau Troffea began dancing in the street one summer morning. No music, no festival, no reason, just frantic, constant movement. People gathered to watch, assuming it was a fit or a joke. But then, she kept going. Hours passed, then days, and before long, others joined her. Within weeks, dozens, maybe hundreds, of people were dancing in the streets, unable to stop. Now, dancing might sound fun, but this wasn't graceful or joyful. It was feverish, desperate, bodies jerking and swaying until feet bled, until exhaustion dropped them unconscious. And even then, many got up and started again. Chroniclers wrote that some collapsed dead from sheer exhaustion. And yet, in the early phases, participants described a dizzy kind of euphoria. It felt irresistible, like their bodies had been taken over by something larger. What caused it? Theories abound. Some say it was ergot poisoning, the same hallucinogenic fungus that caused visions and burning sensations. Others think it was mass hysteria, triggered by stress, famine, or fear. Life in the early 16th century wasn't exactly calm, after all. Or maybe it was a mix. Sick bodies and anxious minds, primed for an outbreak of collective madness. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Entire towns swept up in a bizarre, trance-like height. And Strasbourg wasn't alone. Dancing plagues broke out across Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Some lasted days, some weeks. Sometimes priests tried exorcisms. Sometimes musicians were brought in to play out the frenzy. Ironically, the music often made it worse. Imagine adding drums and fiddles to an already overstimulated crowd. The mania fed itself, until finally, it burned out on its own. Dancing mania wasn't the only mass trance. There were also outbreaks of laughing epidemics, where groups of children or nuns couldn't stop giggling for days. Or biting manias, where convents of nuns suddenly began biting one another, spreading like a strange social contagion. Onlookers often blamed demons or witches, but today we might see stress, malnutrition, and suggestion, the brain slipping into altered states under pressure. These group highs weren't about herbs or wine. They were about psychology and environment. When life was harsh, uncertain, and frightening, the mind sometimes found release in strange, involuntary ways. Dance until your body gives out. Laugh until you cry. Bite until you bleed. To the people inside it, the experience must have felt unstoppable. A rush of energy, bigger than themselves. And the eerie part, even as they suffered, some participants swore they felt lifted, freed, detached from reality. Pain and pleasure blurred. Ecstasy and exhaustion became twins. It was dangerous, but it was also unforgettable. A communal high written not in smoke or drink, but in flesh and bones. So, whether it was Strasbourg's endless dance, or the laughter echoing through cloisters, medieval group manias remind us of something simple. Sometimes, getting high doesn't come from what you put in your body, but from what the mind does when pushed too far. If you were sick in medieval Europe, the word high could take on a very different meaning. You didn't need wine, herbs, or dancing manias to leave your head spinning. All you had to do was visit a doctor. Now, doctor back then didn't look like the white-coated professionals we picture today. Instead, you might find a barber surgeon, the same man who cut hair, pulled teeth, and set broken bones, or an apothecary, mixing powders and potions with equal parts hope and superstition. The truly wealthy had access to trained physicians, but even they relied on ideas passed down from ancient Greece and Rome. Humors, astrology, and remedies that often left patients weaker than when they arrived. Take bloodletting, for example. People believed that illness came from imbalances of the bodies for humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So, if you had a fever, or even just a bad mood, the solution was simple. Drain some blood out. Leeches, knives, or cups heated until they sucked the skin tight. All were tools of the trade, and after losing pint after pint, you might feel lightheaded, faint, maybe even euphoric for a moment. That woozy dizziness, a kind of accidental medieval high. Then there were potions and tonics. Apothecaries often used herbs with real psychoactive effects. Poppy for pain, hemlock for sleep, belladonna to calm the nerves. Sometimes these helped, sometimes they sent patients drifting into hallucinations. A strong enough dose of mandrake or henbane could make you feel like you were floating outside your body. Too strong a dose, though, and you'd float a little too far, permanently. And it wasn't just plants. Medieval medicine leaned heavily on minerals and metals. Mercury, arsenic, and antimony were common ingredients in cures. Imagine swallowing a spoonful of poison and then wondering why your vision blurred or your mind raced. Patients probably did feel something after those treatments, but relief wasn't usually part of it. Even the rituals themselves had a kind of intoxicating effect. Picture lying in a candlelit room, the air heavy with incense, while a physician in long robes whispered prayers over you before cutting open your arm. Between the blood loss, the smoke, and the chanting, your mind would slip into a hazy, altered state. You might even believe you were getting better, if only because the strange ceremony felt powerful. Of course, not all was harm. Some remedies genuinely eased suffering. Honey soothed wounds, willow bark dulled pain, mint settled stomachs. But the line between medicine and mind-altering substance was blurry. Many patients walked away not cured, but dazed, dizzy, or drifting, their treatment leaving them in a state not so different from intoxication. It's sobering, really. In a world without modern science, medicine was as much theater as it was healing. And for the sick and desperate, even a dizzy high was better than nothing. If there was one drug stronger than any medieval potion, it was faith. Religion wasn't just part of life in the Middle Ages. It was life. And with it came its own strange kind of highs. Let's start with fasting. Saints and mystics often went days, weeks, sometimes even months, on little more than bread, water, or nothing at all. When the body weakens from hunger, the mind does funny things. You start to see visions, lights seem brighter, sounds sharper, and dreams slip into waking hours. For many holy men and women, these weren't hallucinations. They were glimpses of heaven. Take Catherine of Siena, for example. She became famous for her extreme fasting, refusing food until she collapsed into ecstatic trances. To her followers, this was proof of divine favor. To modern doctors, it sounds suspiciously like starvation-induced hallucinations. But in the candlelit quiet of a medieval chapel, her visions felt very, very real. And then there were the flagellants. During the plague years, groups of people roamed towns, whipping themselves bloody in an attempt to purify their souls. Pain has its own intoxicating edge, releasing chemicals in the brain that can make you lightheaded or euphoric. Imagine a crowd of men chanting, singing, and lashing their backs until the world blurred into a haze of pain and devotion. That wasn't just piety, it was a full-on altered state. Pilgrimages offered another form of spiritual intoxication. Walking for weeks or months across dangerous roads. Surviving on little food and less sleep, the mind slipped easily into a trance. Pilgrims often reported miraculous visions at holy shrines, glowing lights, voices from the air, even cures for illness. Whether divine or just exhaustion, the experience left them dazed and transformed. Even monastic prayer could produce something like a high. Picture monks chanting for hours, their voices rising and falling in echoing stone halls. The repetition, the rhythm, the flickering candlelight, it lulled the mind into a meditative daze. Mystics described floating outside their bodies, soaring through heavenly realms, or hearing the direct voice of God. In modern terms, you might call it a deeply altered state of consciousness. But here's the thing, these highs weren't accidental. They were sought after. Medieval Christians believed that suffering, hunger, or endless prayer brought them closer to the divine. The dizziness, the visions, the euphoria, all proof they were touching heaven. And unlike the tavern drunkard or the herb-dazed peasant, the mystic's high wasn't shameful, it was holy. So, in a world of plagues, wars, and daily struggles, faith offered not just comfort but escape. Sometimes, escape came not through a chalice of wine or a pipe of herbs, but through the body's own unraveling. Hunger, pain, chanting, and prayer, carrying the mind somewhere else. If religion gave the Middle Ages their solemn highs, Then festivals and carnivals gave them the rowdy ones. Life was hard, often short, and mostly dull. So when the chance came to celebrate, people went all in. Take Carnival, for example. The days leading up to Lent were like the medieval version of Mardi Gras. You had to fast, pray, and behave for 40 long days. So naturally, everyone decided to misbehave as much as possible beforehand. Towns erupted with feasting, drinking, parades, masks, and plays. Men dressed as women, peasants mocked, nobles and fools were crowned kings for a day. In a world of rigid order, Carnival was pure chaos, and chaos can be intoxicating. Then there were the Feasts of Fools, a tradition the church pretended to frown upon but never really stopped. Clergy would dress up in animal costumes, sing Bodhi songs, and parade through the streets half-drunk. Imagine your local priest wearing donkey ears and braying during Mass. It was supposed to be satire, but it looked a lot like medieval stand-up comedy, with wine as the opener. Food itself was part of the high. Most peasants survived on bread, pottage, and the occasional scrap of meat. But during festivals, tables overflowed with roasted pigs, honey cakes, spiced wine, and more. The sudden surge of sugar, fat, and alcohol must have hit their bodies like a lightning bolt. After months of near starvation, gorging on sweets and meat could leave people dizzy, sleepy, and weirdly euphoric. A medieval food coma was its own kind of intoxication. And of course, there was the music and dancing. Minstrels played lutes, fiddles, and drums while crowds spun in circles until they collapsed. Dancing was rarely graceful. It was wild, stomping, and repetitive. Hours of whirling around in heavy wool clothes, half drunk on ale, with bonfires blazing nearby. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. People staggered home afterward in a blur of exhaustion and alcohol, heads spinning just as much as any urban-induced trip. Festivals also gave space for mischief. You could throw flour at your neighbor, steal a chicken, or shout insults at the local lord. And, for one night, no one cared. The release of pent-up frustration created a rush of freedom. For peasants stuck under endless labor and taxes, that freedom felt better than wine. So while monasteries sought highs through prayer and fasting, the villages found theirs in overturned barrels of ale and bonfires that lit up the night sky. Both sides of society, the devout and the rowdy, ended up chasing the same thing. A way to escape the ordinary grind of medieval life, if only for a moment. If you wanted to get lightheaded in the Middle Ages, you didn't always head to the tavern. Sometimes, you went to the local wise woman, hoping she could whip up a potion that would make someone fall madly in love with you. Love potions were everywhere in folklore, and sometimes even in practice. They usually involved herbs like mandrake, henbane, or belladonna, all of which could make your heart race, your pupils dilate, or your mind wander into dreamy confusion. In other words, the perfect recipe for convincing yourself that you were in love, or at least infatuated. One classic ingredient was Spanish fly, a beetle ground into powder. It was supposed to stir up passion. In reality, it was toxic, causing irritation, fevers, and sometimes death. But hey, nothing says romance like a night of feverish hallucinations. Then there were aphrodisiacs. People believed oysters, eggs, almonds, and even onions had the power to boost desire. Was it science? Not really. But if you've been living on barley porridge your whole life, even a spiced almond might feel intoxicating. Superstitions added another layer of romance-induced highs. Some lovers carried charms or wore little bags of herbs to make their crush notice them. Others believed in writing spells, burning them, and inhaling the smoke. Basically, aromatherapy with a dash of desperation. And, of course, the body itself was its own drug. Falling in love releases chemicals that make you giddy, restless, and unable to sleep. Medieval poets described it as an illness, calling it love sickness. Symptoms included sighing too much, staring into space, losing your appetite, and generally acting useless. Sounds like a teenage crush, but with extra layers of melodramatic poetry. The wealthy had even stranger tricks. Nobles sometimes hired alchemists to craft elixirs of love. These mixtures blended exotic spices, wine, and herbs imported at great cost. Whether they worked or not, the sheer expense probably made people feel important. And feeling important can be its own intoxicant. But perhaps the most powerful high of all came from courtly love. That dramatic medieval tradition where knights pined for ladies they could never truly have. The thrill of longing, the endless poetry, the dramatic sighs under moonlight. It was like living inside a never-ending soap opera. Painful, yes, but also addictive. So while peasants were stumbling home from the tavern, nobles were stumbling through castles, dizzy from passion potions, fasting feasts, and unrequited romance. Different paths, same result. A head full of dizzy, dreamy highs. Battle in the Middle Ages wasn't constant. Most peasants lived and died without ever picking up a sword. But for those who did fight, knights, mercenaries, or unlucky villagers called into service, war itself carried a strange kind of high. First, there's the adrenaline. Marching out, drums pounding, banners flying, priests blessing weapons. It created a rush even before swords clashed. Adrenaline sharpens senses, makes time feel strange, and gives a weird sense of invincibility. Some knights described entering a battle fury, swinging wildly as if untouchable. Others compared it to a trance, where they couldn't even remember details afterward, only the blur of noise and motion. Rituals helped fuel that state. Before battle, warriors might drink wine, chant prayers, or perform symbolic gestures. The Vikings, slightly earlier but still influential, were famous for their berserkers men, who supposedly worked themselves into a frenzy by howling, biting shields, and maybe eating hallucinogenic mushrooms. Whether or not the mushrooms were real, the effect was an altered state that made them terrifying opponents. Medieval knights weren't so different. Many wore relics into battle. Bones of saints, scraps of holy cloth, believing they gave divine protection. The psychological effect alone could boost confidence, creating the illusion of strength. And when you feel untouchable, the body follows with that heady, reckless rush. Mercenaries, on the other hand, had a more practical approach. Alcohol. Soldiers often drank heavily before and after fights, partly to dull fear, partly to numb wounds, and partly because it was simply expected. A tipsy army is not exactly disciplined, but it does feel braver, at least until the hangover. There were also whispered stories of battle potions, brews mixed with herbs to give courage. Some may have included stimulants like henbane or mandrake in small doses, enough to dull pain and blur fear, but not enough, hopefully, to kill. Imagine charging into a field, half-dazed, believing you were fueled by magic. It wasn't strategy, but it was a kind of intoxication. And then came the aftermath. Surviving a battle brought its own high, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. Chroniclers sometimes described warriors laughing uncontrollably, crying, or collapsing as soon as the danger passed. The flood of chemicals leaving the body created a kind of natural crash, like the medieval version of coming down from a trip. Of course, behind all that was real horror, wounds, disease, trauma. But in the haze of it, some men grew addicted to the rush. Mercenary bands roamed Europe, not just for money, but because they couldn't stop fighting. The battlefield, with all its blood and chaos, had become their So while peasants sought highs in alehouses and saints in monasteries, knights found theirs with swords in hand, chasing the dizzying rush of adrenaline and survival. Different stage, same craving to escape the ordinary weight of life, if only for a few moments. In the Middle Ages, justice was rarely private. Punishments weren't tucked away behind prison walls. They were paraded out into the open. Stocks, pillories, whippings, and hangings, all staged in town squares. And strangely enough, these events often felt more like festivals than solemn moments. Crowds gathered early, chatting, drinking, sometimes selling food. Children sat on shoulders. Merchants hawked roasted nuts. The condemned man or woman wasn't just a criminal. They were the day's entertainment. For a society with little theater and no Netflix, this was a show. And in that show, the crowd felt a rush. Group psychology took over. When hundreds of people gasped, jeered, or cheered together, It created a shared high, that strange, electric energy of being part of something bigger. Think of a modern sports crowd, but with a much bloodier halftime performance. The punishments themselves often added to the haze. Public floggings drew gasps and laughter. Being locked in a pillory meant hours of humiliation as villagers threw rotten food, mud, or worse, at you. For the spectators, it was cathartic, a release of anger and frustration. For the victim, it was misery. But the imbalance of pain and pleasure created a strange energy that kept people coming back. Executions, especially, carried their own intoxicating weight. A hanging or beheading could draw thousands. The tension built as the condemned was led to the scaffold, priests chanting, drums rolling. Then, in a single moment, it was over. Relief swept through the crowd, often followed by cheering, sometimes even laughter. Morbid, yes, but the adrenaline of waiting, the shock of the act, and the release afterward created something like a communal drug. Some even described execution tourism. People traveled from village to village just to watch famous criminals die. They collected relics, a splinter of the scaffold, a piece of rope, a drop of blood on cloth. Owning such souvenirs gave them a lingering thrill, as if the power of death itself had rubbed off. Even the authorities leaned into the spectacle. Rulers knew that the high of public punishment kept people loyal. It was both entertainment and a warning, a grisly show that left peasants muttering, "Better them than me." Of course, not everyone was swept away. Some wept, some prayed, some even fainted. But for many, the mix of fear, fascination, and shared excitement made punishment not just justice, but a kind of collective intoxication. So while the alehouse gave the individual a dizzy buzz, the scaffold gave the entire town one, a strange, unsettling high, born from pain, ritual, and the strange electricity of a gathered crowd. If you ever stepped into a great Gothic cathedral, even today, you know the feeling. The air changes. The light softens into colors through stained glass. Sounds stretch and echo until they feel endless. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just architecture. It was designed intoxication. Builders knew exactly what they were doing. The towering ceilings and pointed arches weren't just structural tricks. They were meant to make you feel small, humbled, and awestruck. Looking up into that impossible space, your mind lifted too. It wasn't wine or herbs, but it gave the same dizzy drift. Then there was the stained glass. Before smartphones, before neon lights, people's eyes rarely saw color beyond earth tones. Imagine then stepping into a church where sunlight poured through windows of sapphire, ruby, emerald, and gold. The glass told stories of saints and kings, but it also bathed the room in shimmering, dreamlike light. For peasants used to mud and wood huts, it must have felt like another world. And don't forget the music. Gregorian chants floated through stone halls, slow and repetitive, each note stretching into the next. The echoes layered until you couldn't tell where one voice ended and another began. Hours of chanting worked almost like hypnosis. Monks described losing themselves, drifting upward, sometimes even feeling their souls leave their bodies. The scent added to the haze. Incense burned constantly, thickening the air with sweet smoke. It covered the smell of unwashed bodies, yes, but it also created atmosphere. Inhaling it, while staring at flickering candles and glittering altars, made everything seem unreal. As if the church sat halfway between earth and heaven. And then there were the rituals. Kneeling, standing, crossing oneself, repeating prayers. The physical rhythm combined with the sights and sounds to lull minds into a kind of trance. It was choreography for the soul. Even art outside the church could intoxicate. Illuminated manuscripts sparkled with gold leaf, turning simple books into treasures. Frescoes covered walls with bright colors, strange monsters, and heavenly visions. For a mostly illiterate society, pictures weren't just decoration. They were stories, dreams, and hallucinations in paint. Altogether, medieval art and architecture created highs without herbs, without alcohol, without fasting. A peasant could stumble into a cathedral after a muddy day in the fields and leave feeling lifted. lightheaded, and convinced they had brushed against the divine. It was deliberate. The church wanted awe, and awe was its own intoxicant. And for centuries, it worked. For most medieval people, life was tied to the land. They worked it, feared it, depended on it. And nature, with all its cycles, had a way of creating highs without wine, herbs, or ritual. Take springtime. After months of cold, hunger, and darkness, the first green shoots felt miraculous. Imagine eating turnips and stale bread all winter, then suddenly tasting fresh herbs, milk, and honey. The rush of energy from real nutrition alone could make bodies feel alive again. It wasn't magic, just vitamins. But to them, it felt like renewal, almost spiritual. Then there were harvest festivals. After back-breaking labor, peasants gathered to celebrate the year's crops. Drinking, dancing, and singing under autumn skies wasn't just about food. It was relief. The high came from knowing you'd survive another winter. For people living so close to starvation, that relief was euphoric. Nature also provided more literal highs. Hunting, for example. Nobles, in particular, chased deer, boars, and falcons for sport. The thrill of the chase, the pounding heart, the danger. It was adrenaline, not unlike battle, but with less risk of losing your head. Peasants hunted too, though usually in secret, since forests were often reserved for lords. For them, catching a rabbit illegally wasn't just survival. It was a risky thrill in itself. Even the weather brought its own kind of days. Summer heat, after hours in the fields, left people dizzy, lightheaded, sometimes stumbling as if drunk. Winter cold created a strange numbness, where fingers, faces, and thoughts went dull. Medieval records sometimes describe peasants in deep snow laughing, stripping off clothes, and collapsing, not realizing they were near death from frostbite. To them, it must have felt like slipping into a strange, sleepy dream. And then, of course, there were the seasonal celebrations tied to solstices and equinoxes. Bonfires on midsummer's night, maypoles in spring, candles in winter. These weren't just parties. They were rituals of rhythm, reconnecting people to the great cycle of the year. The firelight, the dancing, the endless repetition of songs created a shared, hypnotic state. Almost like the earth itself was the drug, and people were just riding its waves. Even something as simple as lying in a meadow, listening to church bells echo across hills, or watching a falcon soar overhead, could bring that soft, timeless days. The Middle Ages were brutal, yes, but in rare quiet moments, nature gave a different kind of high. Not chaotic, not frightening, but calm, grounding, and strangely euphoric. So while taverns, festivals, and cathedrals offered man-made highs, the fields and forests of medieval Europe gave their own. Subtler, maybe, but no less real. Travel in the Middle Ages wasn't easy. Roads were rough, maps were vague, and inns were questionable at best. Yet people still set out. For trade, for war, for pilgrimage, or simply because they had nowhere else to go. And that journeying brought a different kind of high. Let's start with pilgrimages. Walking hundreds of miles to a shrine might sound miserable, but for the pilgrims, it was transformative. Hunger, blisters, exhaustion, all wore down the body until the mind slipped into a hazy rhythm. Step after step, prayer after prayer, until the road itself became a trance. By the time they reached holy sites like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, they were often half delirious with fatigue and expectation. The sight of a shining cathedral at the end. That was the ultimate payoff, a burst of euphoria after weeks of suffering. Then there were wandering minstrels and troubadours. These performers roamed from village to village, carrying songs and stories. Life on the road was dangerous, but also liberating. Every tavern brought new faces, new patrons, and new wine. The constant motion, the uncertainty, and the thrill of performing for strangers created a strange, restless intoxication. It wasn't stability, but it was adventure. Merchants, too, described a kind of daze from travel, crossing mountains, rivers, and strange towns. They tasted spices, wines, and goods unavailable at home. The sensory overload of marketplaces in foreign lands, with exotic smells, colors, and sounds. Must have been overwhelming. Imagine a wool merchant from England suddenly stepping into a bazaar in Venice. The sheer novelty was intoxicating, even without wine. But travel could also disorient the mind in less pleasant ways. Long days of walking under sun or rain blurred time. Strangers' languages sounded like riddles. Nights in drafty inns, packed with snoring strangers and fleas, left people half dreaming, even while awake. The constant motion, lack of sleep, and mild malnutrition created a kind of permanent haze. Some travelers leaned into this. Pilgrims sometimes described visions on the road, saints appearing in dreams, voices whispering encouragement. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was dehydration. Either way, the road bent reality. And then, of course, there was the thrill of returning home. After weeks or months away, stepping back into a familiar village felt surreal. Almost like waking from a dream. Travelers often returned with new habits, stories, and a slightly dazed look, as if they'd glimpsed a wider world and couldn't quite settle back. That daze lingered like a hangover of the road itself. So, whether chasing relics, singing for supper, or hauling sacks of wool across borders, medieval travelers found themselves caught in a strange, wandering high. Exhaustion, novelty, and faith blurred together, leaving the road as much a drug as a destination. In the medieval world, curiosity was dangerous, intoxicating, and often misunderstood. Chasing knowledge could feel like chasing fire. Bright, alluring, but always threatening to burn. For scholars, alchemists, and astrologers, the pursuit of wisdom had its own strange highs. Take alchemy, for instance. It wasn't just about turning lead into gold, though that dream alone could make men obsessive. Alchemists mixed powders, burned herbs, and distilled strange vapors in smoky rooms. The air was thick with fumes that could make the head spin, blurring the line between experiment and hallucination. Some believed they were brushing against divine secrets. Others simply lost themselves in the haze of their laboratories. Then there was astrology. Night after night, stargazers charted the heavens, convinced the stars whispered truths about love, fate, and kingdoms. Imagine lying awake beneath a black sky, eyes fixed on patterns of light, mind drifting into the cosmic. It was a quiet, contemplative intoxication, one that could make a scholar feel both infinitely small and strangely powerful. The stars weren't just dots in the sky. They were signs, messages, maps of destiny. And reading them felt like touching the pulse of the universe. Even in dusty monasteries, theology and philosophy gave monks their own kind of high. Long nights of copying texts, debating Aristotle, or meditating on the mysteries of God could send the mind spiraling into abstraction. Some monks described moments of clarity so overwhelming they wept, convinced they'd glimpsed divine truth. For them, knowledge was a form of spiritual wine. Of course, not everyone approved. To the church, curiosity could be both holy and heretical. The line was razor thin, pushed too far, and knowledge became temptation, sin, even sorcery. But that tension, that forbidden edge, made it all the more intoxicating. And perhaps the greatest high of all was the dream of discovery. The sense that, hidden in the stars, or in a flask of bubbling liquid, or in a tattered manuscript, was the key to everything. That thrill of being on the verge of almost understanding could keep a mind racing long into the night. So while peasants drank ale and nobles drank wine, some minds drank ideas. And for those few restless souls, the pursuit of knowledge was as dizzying, as addictive, and as dangerous as any medieval drug. For medieval knights, war was more than duty. It was a kind of thrill, a rush of the body and spirit that could feel almost like a drug. Imagine the scene, a knight in full armor, heart pounding beneath layers of steel, the muffled sound of drums, the nervous breath of horses. The moment before a charge, time seemed to stretch thin, fear, pride, and adrenaline tangled into something heady. Something that made men feel alive even as death loomed close. Chroniclers often described battle in religious terms, as if combat was a gateway to transcendence. The clash of swords, the roar of men, the chaos of banners whipping in the wind. It was terrifying, but also euphoric. Some nights became addicted to it, chasing war after war, crusade after crusade, never quite able to live quietly at home. This high wasn't only physical, it was social too. Victory brought songs, feasts, and women's admiration. A knight returned from war with scars and stories, basking in the glow of glory. The memory of that applause could linger like wine, warming him long after the battlefield was silent. Of course, the hangover was brutal. After the frenzy of combat, many knights spoke of emptiness, of drifting aimlessly in peacetime. Some turned to drinking, gambling, or reckless duels to fill the void. Others simply waited for the next war, restless as addicts needing a fix. And let's not forget the tournaments. The safe, sanitized version of battle. Knights would line up for jousts and melees, craving that same rush of impact without the real risk of a battlefield. The tilt of a lance, the cheers of the crowd, the thud of bodies crashing together. It was pageantry, yes, but also a carefully managed high. War, in the medieval mind, wasn't just about land or politics. It was about honor, identity, and the thrill of facing death. It was danger packaged as destiny. And for many knights, there was no stronger intoxication than the feeling of standing in the storm of steel and believing, if only for a moment, that God himself was watching. Religion in the medieval world wasn't just about prayer and sermons. For many, it was about chasing an almost physical high. Moments of ecstasy that blurred the line between body and soul. Think of the mystics. They fasted until their bodies trembled, prayed until their voices broke, and meditated until visions poured into their minds. Saints like Hildegard of Bingen or Catherine of Siena described their experiences like being set on fire from within. They saw dazzling lights, heard choirs of angels, and claimed to feel the very presence of God coursing through them. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To them, it was the ultimate intoxication. Pilgrimages, too, carried their own strange high. Imagine walking for weeks through mud and rain, your feet blistered and your stomach empty. And then, suddenly, arriving at Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury. The relief, the joy, the tears. It was like a wave crashing over the soul. Pilgrims hugged relics, kissed shrines, and wept as if a great weight had lifted. Exhaustion and faith combined into something euphoric. Even ordinary rituals carried their own kind of lift. The sound of a cathedral choir echoing through stone vaults. The glow of stained glass filtering colored light onto bowed heads. The smell of incense curling like smoke toward heaven. All of it worked together like sensory alchemy, pulling minds into a trance. Some monks and nuns even wrote about moments of almost embarrassing intensity. Their visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary were described in language that sounded less like prayer and more like romance. Spiritual union was often expressed in terms of longing, passion, even physical closeness. The boundary between divine love and human desire blurred. And in that blur, mystics found a dizzying, dangerous joy. Of course, the church was cautious. Ecstasy was holy if it fit doctrine, heretical if it didn't. Too much vision, too much emotion, and you risked being labeled a fraud or a witch. But that danger only heightened the experience. The way every intoxicant is sharpened by the risk it carries. For many medieval souls, faith wasn't just about obedience. It was about chasing glimpses of the divine, about tasting heaven in fleeting, overwhelming bursts. A spiritual high, one might say, addictive in its own quiet way. If you lived in a medieval court, love wasn't just a private feeling. It was a spectacle, a game, a ritualized performance that could sweet people up like wine. This was the world of courtly love. Knights swore themselves to noble ladies, writing poems, singing ballads, and fighting duels in their honor. Half the time, these ladies were married to someone else, usually a rich, powerful lord, who probably didn't find the situation nearly as romantic. But that was the thrill. Forbidden affection. Longing glances across crowded banquets. The secret exchange of a handkerchief or a lock of hair. Poets and troubadours made this ritual into an art form. They compared their loves to angels, flames, or divine light. The language was over the top, as if one stolen kiss might carry the weight of salvation, and people loved it. The entire concept of romance, as we know it today, traces back to these fevered poems and sighing nights. Of course, there was a darker side. Courtly love was intoxicating because it was rarely consummated. Desire was left dangling, stretched out, never satisfied, and that longing itself became addictive. A knight could spend years writing verses for a lady he could never have. He would pine, suffer, and call it noble. Because apparently in the Middle Ages, being miserable was the height of sophistication. Still, the high was real. The flutter of secrecy, the thrill of proximity, the dizzying mix of fear and excitement. Love wasn't just a private passion. It was a performance that carried reputations, inspired wars, and sometimes toppled entire dynasties. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, patroness of troubadours, and one of the great queens of the Middle Ages. Under her influence, southern France became the capital of courtly love. Her courts buzzed with music, poetry, and flirtation. And though it all seemed playful, it shaped politics too. Affections turned into alliances, scandals into feuds, and whispered affairs into dangerous rivalries. The hangover, of course, was brutal. Marriages crumbled, reputations shattered, jealous husbands picked up swords. But in the moment, the high was worth it. For nobles trapped in rigid lives of duty and arranged unions, romance was rebellion, a sweet, intoxicating escape. And so, in the candlelit halls of castles, amid the music of lutes and the rustle of gowns, love itself was a drug, one that promised joy, delivered heartbreak, and left behind a haze of poetry that still lingers today. For medieval nobles, feasting was more than eating. It was theater, a sensory overload designed to impress, overwhelm, and, if we're honest, to knock everyone into a kind of food-and-induced stupor. Picture a banquet in a castle. Long tables groaning under the weight of dishes, tapestries glowing in the firelight, and musicians tucked in a corner playing soft melodies while people stuffed their faces. The courses came one after another. Soups, pies, whole animals roasted until golden, platters of fish, and delicate little pastries. Some dishes were purely for show. A peacock roasted and then redressed in its own feathers. A pie that, when cut open, released live birds that flew around the hall. Because apparently, dinner wasn't dinner unless it had a built-in circus act. And then, of course, there was the drinking ale and beer for the lower classes. Rich, heavy wines for the nobles. Spiced, mulled, and mixed with honey until the line between medicine and alcohol got blurry. Toasts went on for hours. People staggered from the tables red-faced, belching, and convinced they were having the time of their lives. The high wasn't just physical, it was social. To be seated near the Lord was an honor. To have the biggest goblet, the choicest cut of meat, or the loudest laugh meant you were in favor. Feasting was about hierarchy as much as indulgence. Every bite was a symbol of wealth and power. Of course, the hangovers were legendary. Medieval medicine books are full of advice for banquet headaches and stomach heaviness after meats. One popular remedy was just more wine, but with herbs tossed in, which is basically the medieval version of chasing a greasy breakfast with a Bloody Mary. And while peasants lived on bread, porridge, and the occasional onion, nobles drowned in variety. The contrast itself was intoxicating. To gorge yourself while the majority starved wasn't tea, just indulgence. It was a way of proving you were above the ordinary rules of hunger and need. So yes, feasting was a high. A communal, messy, gluttonous high that left bellies aching and floors sticky with spilled ale. Nobles may not have had modern nightclubs, but in their halls, under candlelight and songs, they found their own form of intoxication. One bite and one toast at a time.